yeah, firstly, a warm welcome to everyone who's joined the call. Yeah, I'm currently in South Africa. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon on a Friday. I did just get a notification that my area where I stay in is being affected with load shedding. Luckily, that's only in an hour's time, but it does mean I need to keep this talk confined to an hour because, yeah, I guess all my monitors will shut down when load shedding hits. For those of you that don't know what load shedding is, it's essentially where the government robs us 4 hours or 2 hours of the day from our rights to have electricity. And I guess from their side, it's really about maintenance reasons to maintain the power plants. But yeah, it's quite I believe, quite a unique thing to SA. It's not fun. Dishes piles rack up. You can't do your washing when you want to. Yeah, and they cheekily hit us on a Friday evening from 6 to 8:30. It's not nice. But yeah, let's get going. So today's talk is really just a practical guide to Web3 security. It is more aimed at kind of, startups, much like Float, and to get, yeah, kind of the brain fluids moving, to give you guys a bit of perspective on the importance of security. So yeah, it really is a footholding, I guess, to get, startups like us started in the security field. And I'll be talking about why that is so important in a few slides' time. Firstly, maybe a bit more information about myself. So my name's Sven. It's literally pronounced like 7, the number, without the first E. But on the other hand, I don't really mind what people call me. Go by the name Sveno a lot as well. It's my lens handle, by the way. But what I don't like is when people call me Swen. So yeah, accentuate the V there, like the number 7. But yeah, that's enough about my name. Born and bred in Cape Town, South Africa. Did a joint honors in information systems and financial management, and started off my career as an information security and risk management consultant, primarily servicing the JSE top 40 clients. For those of you that don't know what the JSE top 40 is, it's a stock exchange, much like the S&P 500 or NASDAQ, but this is in South Africa, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. And yeah, worked with big corporate clients, and yeah, these clients were mostly in the insurance and financial sector. So I think that's very relevant since we're also, I guess, a finance or a protocol in the finance space. Yeah, found myself doing that this would have been my 5th year before joining Float. For the last 2 years, I was spending every day specializing in AWS cloud security, a really, really interesting field. And also just cloud computing is another booming industry right now. So that was really interesting. But I did somehow feel myself diverging away from my kind of true passion, which does involve finance. So I was very security focused, and I kind of felt like a change and wanted to involve more finance again. So yeah, earlier this year, I joined Float. I'm currently at Float as a business development representative, as well as a project manager. And in my spare time, I really enjoy riding bicycles with my mates. If I'm not on the bike, I'm in the mountains, trail running, or working on just creative passion projects as a nice outlet to keep, yeah, the brain juices flowing. Cool, guys. So what's on the agenda today? The topic is a practical guide to Web3 security. So I've pretty much broken that down into a few areas of discussions. So the first one is just, it's always good to start with the foundation, and we build on top of that. So I really just want to talk briefly about some principles around security. Then I'll be going into a bit more around the landscape, comparing Web 2 and Web 3. And then diving more into the weeds, specifically around the practical steps. I mean, that's why we're here today. One is culture, and then I'll be moving on to the DevOps kind of life cycle, where we incorporate security as well, which is called DevSecOps. And then lastly, incident response. So these are all important areas that speak to security. And each of these areas will have, I guess, practical steps to, as a startup that's kind of confused, what to do about security, to get the ball rolling in that regard. So to start off with some principles. So firstly, it's always important to look at security holistically. And when we talk about security, we're talking about kind of information and data security. And that consists of three main components. We call it the CIA triad. So that's your confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And each of these components represent the fundamental element of information security. For example, let's look at the industry that involves petrol manufacturing plant, or say Mercedes, an automobile manufacturing plant. They might not necessarily be too concerned about confidentiality, but much more concerned about availability. So every second that manufacturing plant experiences downtime, they're essentially losing millions. So, in the case of a Mercedes automobile manufacturing plant, they will be very focused on keeping their infrastructure up and running, accounting for any single points of failure, implementing redundancies, failovers, to really just make sure as their primary business objective when it comes to security, that plant remains running. And then maybe as a secondary thought, they are interested in confidentiality. Perhaps they've got IP about future releases about their cars, or some technology that's really gonna open new opportunities, and that's their competitive edge. So they might be protecting that. Perhaps they store some information about their customers. Perhaps the finance division in Merck offering kind of the financial services. But as their primary focus, it's really about the availability, because every minute that plant is down, they are losing millions. And maybe more related into, the space we find ourselves in, blockchain, Web3, DeFi, something like a decentralized exchange that's doing, say, $50 million of trading volume every day. If their front end is unavailable, yes, I guess the technical guys can still interact with the contracts, but majority of your user base, let's even call it 95%, are interacting via the UI. And so if an attacker is able to get hold of your website or manipulate it in some form or fashion that renders the UI unavailable, I would also say, this DEX is also going to be making a heavy loss for that day, which definitely eats big time into their revenues. So if an attacker gets hold of their website and they bring it down, 95% of your users can't actually do swaps or trade. And they'll also experience huge financial losses, especially if you're doing 50 million trading volume a day. Just wanted to dive a bit into that CIA triad, because we will literally be taking that with us throughout this talk. And that is the core of the apple that everything's built upon. Then if we look more to the right on the slide, I've just got another more fundamental kind of diagram, which is that, security controls Okay, say we've decided confidentiality is really important for us. Now looking at confidentiality, we like, okay, what controls can we implement? And I just want to highlight with this diagram, it's really not just about kind of technology or technical controls. Let's say for confidentiality, yes, you most definitely want to turn on encryption on your database, just as an example. But it's really not limited to technical controls. In fact, it involves your people, your entire culture in your organization or your entity. It involves also just processes. A perfect example of a process is your DevSecOps lifecycle, which we'll be going into later today. And then your technologies, and that really more speaks to your technical controls. So cool. Now that we are equipped with some security fundamentals, let's go into the Web 2 versus Web 3 landscape. So I think immediately we know that the Web 2 industry has been around for a much longer time. And as a result, the industries are, I would say, much more heavily regulated. I mean, we are following the news in the DeFi and the crypto space on regulations every day, because bills are being passed in respective jurisdictions, and that really is important for us to be on top of. But that's still very much an evolving space, whereas Web 2 has been around for a number of years, and they are very regulated. I would say with confidence that most of you have probably come across the term GDPR, which essentially it's more of a European standard for the EU. But if you're storing or processing or sending personal information about your users or customers, you essentially need to comply with GDPR. And then there's things that come into play, like where are you storing the data, how are you protecting it, are you doing cross-border transfers, etc. So that's an example of a very popular, I would say, industry, or not really an industry framework, it's more of a regulatory framework, GDPR, across the whole EU, any entity that processes personal information. Maybe more of an industry related framework that's also very well known out there is something like PCI DSS. It's when you process financial transactions and credit card facilities where you need to now comply with the standard. So as we can see, Web 2 is much more regulated than the Web 3 space. Web 3 space being very much still on the evolving side. And as such, Web 2 companies do store, personal and financial information. This might be partly due to, how they operate, as in they need our information, or due to compliance requirements such as your KYC and your AML policies. Whereas in Web 3, we kind of don't have KYCs unless it's centralized. But kind of, I would say a big crux of Web 3 is that it promotes anonymity and privacy. Cool. I'd also say that Web 2 companies are much more mature, and we could argue they are probably much more mature because they're much more heavily regulated, but they've also been around the block for quite some time. And just in my experience, looking at Web 2 companies and working with them, they've got their ducks in a row. They've got the information security and management practices in play. They would have governance in place that mandates, the organization to do annual maturity assessments to see how their security posture is doing. They do continuous risk assessments on all of their applications and their software and their databases, etc. Whereas this is something we haven't really come across in the Web3 space yet, partly because it's a very new space and evolving. And I guess most of the companies in the space are kind of, starting out as a startup. Comparing the two, I would say they are very similar in terms of the technologies and so controls we apply. But Web3 also introduces, as well as reduces new attack vectors. So what we've got in Web3 now is something like, you know, your blockchain and smart contracts. And this opens up new surface areas to new types of attacks. Something like smart contract exploits that we are seeing day in and day out. Something niche about Web3 is also that transactions are immutable, which means, you know, they cannot be reversed once they've taken place. And this, in comparison to Web2, you know, where we can react to security incidences and most of the time actually roll back or reverse the action. So yeah, we can already see that Web3 demands to be much more preventative rather than just relying on detection and response, because transactions are immutable. If something's already occurred, it can't be rolled back. And traceability is also much more difficult as Web3 promotes anonymity and privacy. Yeah, so that's kind of just comparing, just at a glance, Web2 versus Web3 landscape. Next, I just wanted to go through a very cool dashboard that DeFi Llama has, I think it's new, if I'm not mistaken, has recently released. And this is a dashboard of all the Web3 attacks that are taking place over the last couple of years. So if we just look at the dates, these are all dates. Okay, we've got a 2017 here at the bottom, but most of these all occurred this year. And what I had done before taking the screenshot, I ordered this in kind of descending fashion. So we'll have the attack with the highest value, or yeah, the value that was at risk or was stolen or lost first. And we can see these are 9-digit numbers, which is huge. $624 million, which was the Ronin attack earlier this year. And then, yeah, I mean, just to highlight this Ronin attack, you know, the cause of this was, I think we can see it here on the right side where I've got the orange box. This was due to a private key compromise through social engineering. So this had nothing to do with, you know, whether your smart contracts were, you know, coded and developed securely and audited. This has nothing to do with your front end and whether that's secure. This has nothing to do with your DevOps pipeline. This was probably literally, you know, an employee at the company receiving an email and being socially engineered by a cyber attacker, also commonly referred to as phishing. I guess where, you know, we're tricked to do something where the attacker either acts as an employee of the same organization. Essentially, you know, someone was tricked and that hacker was able to compromise the private key and orchestrate his attack, and thereby stealing $624 million. And then just looking at these, we've got the poly network and the wormhole. Here we can see that, you know, these are due to access control exploits, a signature exploit. So that's not really around kind of, you know, people, but now that's more going into the kind of the technology aspect where these sound like smart contract exploits, where, you know, as part of due diligence before deploying a smart contract, most definitely get your contracts vetted with, you know, third-party independent auditors and reputable ones. So yeah, we can see that these attacks are occurring through various ways. And I think what's obvious is that they are occurring. So, you know, and it's not slowing down either. As I think the whole ecosystem grows and more value is being transferred from TradFi into DeFi, this is just going to increase the incentive for, you know, adversaries to take advantage of exploits and exfiltrate funds. Yeah, and these attacks, as we know, can be super crippling. In fact, leading to full business closure at times, especially if you're a young protocol. But yeah, I think what I'm really trying to bring across here is that attacks are continuously making headlines. And so we need to adopt a mentality, or let's not be naive about this, but we need to adopt a mentality of, when we get hacked, how are we adequately prepared and how quickly can we respond to restore to, normal business operations and minimize any form of impact, whether that's now, related to funds or availability. And we can't be naive here and say, it's not a matter if we get hacked. We should rather assume on the basis that we will most probably get hacked down the line. And if so, how adequately have we prepared ourselves as an organization to respond to that attack? I also think that there's a common misconception maybe between small companies where they're more following the mentality of, who would want to hack us? I mean, there's this other big protocol that's holding, 50x TVL, why us? And there I just want to say, the unfortunate reality is, people tend to go for the lowest hanging fruit, and cyber criminals, want to hack you because you are a small company. You don't have a security budget, you don't have a security team, and you most likely also don't have security tools that will, alert you on kind of malicious or potentially malicious activity. And so as a result, you as a small company are actually a perfect target. Cool. Yeah, I think I've brought my points across here. So now we're getting into the weeds of things. So this is really more kind of the practical part of the presentation. And yeah, I really hope that all the listeners on the call can take, 3 things with them today. But the first one I want to touch on is culture. So that's your people in your organization. And unfortunately, people are also our weakest link. I mean, as we saw with the Ronin attack, people can easily be, I guess, manipulated or tricked. And so, your staff are essentially, let's call it the human firewall. And as such, you need to ensure that your organization has kind of a security mentality. And how can we bring this about? Well, I think a good start would be to have your leadership as change ambassadors, to really communicate from top down across the organization or across your small team that, security is really important, and that, kind of maybe also highlight the repercussions if you don't take security seriously. And yeah, your leadership are supposed to act as change ambassadors, so that your organization can start shifting its mindset to a security first approach. And what that means is basically everything you do, you're doing this with security in mind. You're submitting a new PR, don't commit any passwords or private keys. I think as a best practice, but especially not if it's a public repo, or even if it's a private repo. Unfortunately, employees also become disgruntled sometimes. So really adopting that security first approach, and I would say that needs to come top down from IT leadership. Then it's also a matter of, in terms of your culture, to ingrain it into everyone that, security is not just your CTO's or your CISO's responsibility. They might be ultimately accountable for kind of overseeing the information security program, but it is everybody's responsibility when it comes to security. Yeah, another good one is just upskilling programs. And I can't stress this enough. There are great e-learning platforms out there, like let's name Udemy as an example, where you could, just have a bit of a mandate where you send all your developers on secure development courses, say once every 6 months. So yeah, really just upskilling through training programs, or seek external help. If you as an entity are not, big enough, there's lots of security consultants out there that do training programs, etc. Another good step or practical step to do is to have an information security policy. So part of your HR onboarding process, when someone joins your company, you also have them attest to the fact that they've read the information security policy, that we take security very seriously. That policy would have things like the do's and don'ts. And yeah, you have them sign off, and I guess just hold them to it. As I've said, security is kind of everyone's responsibility, and you really want that assurance that security is being taken seriously. And then lastly, it's is to establish a security response team. Be clear in your organization who those people are who are responsible for security. And yeah, just I guess, just be clear on having kind of a security team that will start driving kind of the security efforts and strategy going forward, such as implementing a training program. So I think that's enough about the kind of culture aspects. And that really kind of spoke to the people element. Next, I'll be diving into more of a process element, which is the DevSecOps life cycle. So yeah, this is really cool. This is where your CI/CD pipelines come into play. You do a commit, you have it reviewed, approved, you merge the PR, you've got your testnet automatically deploying. And that's pretty much what we mean with kind of DevOps. Obviously, there's the fact, once the system's production, there's some operational activities that you do, such as your monitoring tools, where you've got, I guess Prometheus or other monitoring tools where you're monitoring for availability and capacity. But now you've got this nice kind of DevOps life cycle. For every organization, it looks a bit different, but the fundamentals are the same. And now we want to see, how can we embed security into this? And why would we do that? Isn't it going to slow things down? Well, in actual facts, not necessarily. So, we really would want to embed security into the life cycle. We want to make it as automated as possible. But ultimately, it's easier to fix your vulnerabilities during development than finding these vulnerabilities after the fact in production. And with easier, I mean effort and duration spent, which again is, time and money and resources. And it's also cheaper to fix vulnerabilities, during development rather than in production. And cheaper because, you mostly, you've got your code in bite-sized chunks, you've got your packages, it's not all running as a cohesive unit yet. So it's really just easier and cheaper to fix vulnerabilities early on in the process. What does a DevSecOps lifecycle look like, and what does it entail? We'll go into that next. So we can see here in the diagram, this is pretty much a DevOps cycle where we're starting with the dark blue in the middle, where you plan, you do your coding, you set up your build, you do some testing, and then you release it into your test environment, and you ultimately deploy it into production. And then, this is now an operational system where you want to implement all sorts of kind of monitoring tools. And now we want to implement security into this cycle. And really, this talk is not to go into like kind of the deep end here. It's really just, kind of first practical steps that you could take. So the first one we've got here is really when it revolves around kind of still the coding phase. It's really easy to integrate an automated tool that kind of scans your code while you're coding, and will let you know about vulnerabilities. And then you can even set up your pipeline such that you won't be able to push this code into another environment, say from dev to test, or dev test to prod, if you've got, say, a high severity vulnerability. And now you kind of can already see you're embedding security in your DevOps kind of life cycle. And trying to obviously make it as automated as possible, because security ultimately can be an enabler, and doesn't necessarily need to slow things down. So that's when you're coding. You can have in our field, it's called SAST, so static source code analysis. It's a plugin where you've got your code being scanned in real time while you're developing. Oh, this package or this library you've just imported is making use of a deprecated piece of software that is no longer being maintained and has these vulnerabilities. The next one is you've done with your coding, and now you're kind of in your test environment now, and you're actually dynamically running your application. So we're not looking at it via the code, we're actually looking at it via, say, the UI now. And there you can run, another form of tests, which essentially it's similar, but now you're testing your kind of web application or whatever you're developing, kind of via the front end and the UI. So that's another step you can implement. And then when it comes to deployment or pre-deployment to production, you want to so now you've done kind of your I would say your hygiene checks with your kind of just automated code analysis tools. You've dealt with all the lowest hanging fruits. You should be all good. And now you want looking to deploy into production. But before you do that, as we know, you would have your smart contracts undergo an audit, and perhaps your front end also undergo some form of security assessment. This is mostly done via an independent third-party entity, because you want that kind of external approval. In some jurisdictions, the regulators actually require that. You need that kind of stamp of approval from a independent third party. But yeah, this is where you would do kind of a vulnerability assessment or smart contract audits. That doesn't just involve using tooling to scan code and find vulnerabilities. People actually manually testing, finding loopholes. So that's another very important step in the DevOps lifecycle. And then once you've deployed and you're in production, ideally you want to set up security monitoring tools. Software that can, uses maybe AI to detect malicious transactions or transactions that look or are behaving outside of the norm. And that's really where, that's kind of the last step where you'd implement these monitoring solutions. And then on, say, an annual basis, you'll want to relook at your whole DevSecOps kind of life cycle and see, where you can improve, maybe even measure it against a maturity framework, and how mature are we? And that maturity kind of goes, first you put up your processes, and then you first act with those processes. And how you mature is, ideally you want to automate these processes, whereas some of your initial processes, like it is kind of starting out, could be manual. Right, so that's about DevSecOps, and that was more of kind of a process element to talk about. And then moving on, we've got another, I guess, process-related kind of security control, which is security governance control, which is your incident response process. Yeah, and like I've mentioned earlier, organizations should not be naive to the realities of cyber attacks, irrespective of the size of your organization. Instead of thinking if we'll ever be hacked, you should really start approaching the mentality when we get hacked. How adequately prepared are we to resolve this incident and recover from it? And so, although measures and mitigations can be put in place to drastically reduce the likelihood of a cyber attack from materializing, and here are just examples, front-running protection mechanisms to prevent price manipulation. You can have a multi-sig wallet, to custody your investor capital. You can go through lengths of smart contract audits with the biggest kind of auditing firms. You're doing regular web application scans on your front end. Maybe your front end has permissions to interact with the database or your contracts that has, specific admin privileges, and perhaps people can get hold of these admin privileges via your front end if your front end is not secure. So we should always assume worst case scenario. And unfortunately, as much as we can implement all of these protection mechanisms, that is not enough, because that is being preventative. But we should also start changing our mindset to, when we get hacked, what are we going to do? How are we going to respond to this? And so as much as these controls are all amazing and excellent, it's unfortunately not good enough. And that's where we get to the incident response process. So yeah, what steps can organizations take in this kind of response process? And that's what we'll be going through now. For those that are asking, what an incident response process is, it's essentially like a procedural document that outlines a predetermined set of instructions on how to detect, respond, and limit the consequences of a malicious attack against your information systems. The response plan is typically comprised of 4 main components. So we've got the preparation phase, the detection and analysis phase. Then we move on to actually containing the incident after we've analyzed and confirmed that it's an incident, and kind of recovery. And then lastly, you do always a post-incident activity where you go through lessons learned. Is there anything we could have done better? Can we improve our monitoring tools? Why didn't we pick this up? Are there some, refinements to be made? And so it's always important to reflect and improve as part of that post-incident activity. So the preparation phase, this is really preparing your team for an incident. It's pretty much what I've been talking about, not a matter of if, but when we get hacked. So it's changing that mindset, preparing your team. Then it's identifying your team, who is going to be the response team? Who are those key stakeholders that we need to be involved if we suffer an incident? And then once you've got your team, ideally you want to do a sort of like a triage where you assess, and again, this is dependent on what industry you operate in, what type of business you are, but you want to identify the top scenarios that are applicable to your industry. And what I mean with scenarios, attack scenarios. So, in our case, in the blockchain space and DeFi, smart contracts exploits are a common thing. GitHub compromises are a common thing. And so you want to essentially simulate these attacks as part of this response plan, so that when the day comes and this is actually taking place, to an extent, you've already prepared yourself for this and can respond adequately. Yeah, then as part of the preparation phase, you also want to know, how do we invoke the response team? So now we know what the response team is. We know our top applicable scenarios. You know, if kind of shit does hit the fan, how do we invoke this team? And that's kind of what your preparation section of this big procedure document entails. And then you go on to detection and analysis. And this is basically ensuring that you have the right tools and processes in place so that you firstly can detect the incident in a timely fashion, as well as determine the scope and impact of the incident. You know, is it confined to kind of this specific area, or is there maybe a knock-on effect? You know, are we just going to pause this smart contracts, or do we need to, you know, shut down the whole system? So that's really what this phase is about. And then also to identify, you know, immediate actions that you can take. So now you've analyzed, okay, we're actually suffering a smart contract exploit. You know, do we have a run book for this? And that run book or that scenario that we've simulated should already have immediate actions that you can take place. So that's detection and analysis, and that will adequately prepare you to now get into the next phase, which is about containment and recovery. This is where you would, I guess, start your kind of recovery steps, as well as your communications plan. And communications plan is really, really important. From kind of a regulatory perspective, at least, I guess, in certain industries. But also just because, you know, everything you can say, if you're suffering an incident, you know, can have legal and reputational ramifications. So you want to make sure as part of your communications plan that you get factually correct information. And that's why you're performing kind of your analysis phase and really determining the impacts and the scope of the incident. But yeah, you really want to get that factually correct information. You don't want to provide misinformation, and to the right people at the right time. And there's various groups of people. I mean, you've got your users that could be affected. You've got your investors. Maybe you've got ecosystem partners or integration partners. And so, yeah, I guess this phase, containment and recovery, is really about containing the incident and communication, getting the factually correct information to the right people at the right time. I mean, just GDPR, for example, processing personal information. If organizations suffer a breach, I mean, they're mandated to report to their information regulator in the jurisdiction they operate in, you know, that they've suffered a breach. If not, you know, aside from suffering a breach, you might be slapped with a fat fine by the information regulator and the government. Cool. And then post-incident activity. You've communicated properly, you've given regular updates, you've contained, you've recovered. Now you go into post-incident activity where, you know, you want to reflect, you know, how did, you know, did we do everything correctly? What can we improve on? Perhaps you want to get like a post-mortem report out there as well. So that's really what this phase is about. Then, cool. Time for some free resources for those of you that are interested. We at Float have actually recently undergone a similar exercise to this. So we've recently developed our incident response plan. It is in our GitHub repo. I've got the link here below, and I'll be showing just one or two screenshots from that, but it is publicly available for you to view. In that response plan, we've also identified, you know, the top applicable incident scenarios that, you know, we believe are applicable to us, and exactly kind of what steps we would take to mitigate these unfortunate events. And what does something like this look like? So, you know, sorry, Bull, here's an example of the 4 scenarios that we've identified. Obviously, this needs to be revised perhaps on a biannual or annual basis to still see if it's fit for purpose. But we've got something like smart contract exploits. We've got market manipulation, that renders our markets unusable. We've got GitHub compromise. And then lastly, since we've got integration partners and, supply chain attacks are also a thing to consider. If one of, say, our partners go down, let's take, Chainlink as an example, how are we going to react to that? And so we've identified these scenarios so that we are adequately prepared to respond to this when something like this would take place. Cool. And then I'm just going through, say, one scenario, which is the smart contract exploit. So here you've got essentially your playbook or your run book. So this is the exact steps we'd follow. We'd use our tools to review the exploited transaction and be alerted on some malicious behavior. We'd use debugging tools, kind of transaction replay tools. Then we'd kind of aim to pause our contracts if possible, or take another defensive action. Then we'd review our other contracts to see if there's any kind of, knock-on vulnerabilities, and also pause those as necessary, or take other defensive actions. If this exploit renders our system unavailable, we'd update our UI to reflect the current status, and so on. And then, we go through this run book. It's almost like a checklist. It's a predetermined simulation of an attack. And I think you guys can see there's names against these. So these friends here are, they're part of the security response team. So as part of preparation, we had identified, who needs to be part of the security response team and what their responsibilities are. And so we've gone through the simulated kind of response to a smart contract exploit. And we are very clear on who is responsible for what, because in practice, I think an attack is very different than in theory. It's stressful times, for example, and you really want to have a crystal clear picture of what steps to take and who needs to take those steps. And I think that pretty much summarizes my Share Friday for today. Just to recap, we spoke about your foundational information security principles. So we went through the CIA triad. Hope that's all kind of embedded into all of you. Really powerful foundation just to always take with you when applying kind of security scenarios. We went through that, security needs to be viewed as a holistic approach across people, process, and technology. And then we went into this. So we went first into the culture, how we can improve your security culture within your team or your organization. We compared Web2 versus the Web3 landscape. And then we looked at your DevOps process and how you could kind of transition into a DevSecOps process. And then lastly, that response process are happening all the time. And who knows, anybody really could be next. As much as you implemented excellent preventative measures, there's a first time for everything. And when that day does come, you do want to be adequately prepared. Cool, guys. I hope you enjoyed the talk. I hope you found it very informative. It is under the hour. Load shedding's not quite hitting me just yet. So I've got 5 minutes to look through any questions, if there are any. Just checking through the chat here. A lot of GMs. No one going to sleep yet. There's no GNs. Crypto solves this. Don't know what point you were speaking to HMS Reefer, but most definitely. So crypto, as much as it introduces attack surfaces, it also reduces a lot of lot of pain points. I mean, one example would be, say, the availability factor of the blockchain, which is a big part of kind of your backend and your database. We really don't need to worry about kind of failover mechanisms there, or restoring your database in another data center. I mean, it's on the kind of decentralized blockchain network. Cool. Someone's sharing a resource. Okay, Jason's analysis of smart contract hacks. Very nice. I will look at that. Note that because blockchains are public, breaches are almost always known instantly and publicly observable. In Web2 environment isn't really the case. Yeah, that's actually a really interesting point. Yeah, I mean, who knows? There could be a lot of undisclosed attacks that are happening in the Web2 space that aren't really, haven't made it into the public eye and been scrutinized and analyzed. Whereas in Web3, yeah, unfortunately, it's all public. If your TVL suddenly goes down, cool, guys. Can incident response be automated in any way? Yeah, most definitely. That's, again, part of kind of your maturity life cycle. Again, you want to start off with the process. You want to run with that process. You want to see if it's working. And if it's working, then you would consider automating certain parts. I can't off the bat think of a practical example related to like the blockchain specifically, but in my old world, I was doing security in the AWS cloud environment for a financial institution. And there we implemented automated guardrails. So it's not really, I guess it could be related to incident response, because you've got, this financial institution with hundreds of dev teams. They all have quite a lot of autonomy. And say one of the dev teams deploy a database with, sensitive data, and by mistake, or, maybe they didn't know better, make it public. In the cloud, you can make your database easily, public quite easily. You could automatically have a detection tool that then triggers auto remediation that turns encryption on, for example. So I guess if you really do want to look into automation, I would first say, look at your top applicable scenarios. And given what those scenarios are, you would then consider, okay, where can we automate, certain activities? Maybe you auto-deprecate a market based on a specific event that occurred. Cool. Thanks for that question. That was really power. HMS Reaper. Jason, at a contract level, we have checks that look for anomalies, tongue twister, and activate a circuit breaker of sorts. But at the end of the day, a human is needed. It's kind of like a contract risk module that we built in. Power stuff, security first approach. But yeah, cool, guys. I really hope you enjoyed that chat. We're just under the hour. And yeah, have yourselves a power Friday and weekend. See you Monday to continue the shipping. All right, cheers, guys.